All right. Looks like we are quickly moving into week four of uh, Fire 351. This week, we're talking about planning, land use, and economics of wildfires. So let's talk a little bit about all of that. So the human population is continuing to expand. This we know. It's increasing on resource demands, depleting environmental natural resources, and smart planning and increasing efficiency is one of the themes that's emerged in the last 20 years or so. And it's talking a lot about how we deal with environmental degradation and climate change and all the things that common conversation is. And so sustainability is one of those words that that gets used quite a bit. The goal here is to minimize growth of this, what we call the ecological footprint, how much of an impact humans have on the planet. And there's both direct and indirect impacts that are associated with this. And the reason we talk about this is because, of course, what we do with the land and how we manage that land has a direct implication to our fire risk as well. And so removal of habitat, albeit, for development, agriculture, mining, resource extraction, or over harvesting, things like fishing and timber, are considered direct impacts. The indirect impacts are things like increasing pollutants, right? Runoff and water and air pollution, the spread of non-native or exotic species, fragmentation of our ecosystems, and then even human-caused wildfires. Are both sort of indirect and direct impacts of all of these types of activities. Now, within any sort of ecosystem or any sort of system that we're going to deal with, there's this overall reduction in biodiversity that goes along with that as well. And one of the things that we recognize with all of this is that there's a lot of value in species and in biodiversity, and there's not just the monetary value from trade or other things, but there's an intrinsic value, and then there's other issues related to new medicines and technologies, food sources, forest products, all of that. But at the same time, when you're having these sort of uses of the environment and you're extracting them for human purposes, there's also a loss of ecosystem services, which in some economists' minds are valued in the trillions of dollars annually. And this is, the things that ecosystems provide us: flood control, air and water quality, and that sort of purification process. Wildfire protection in healthy ecosystems is actually a thing as well. The pollination of crops, controlling pests, all of that is something that our ecosystem does naturally. And then there's other stuff that we haven't, put clear dollar amounts to, but it, falls under the sort of cultural and spiritual aspects of land as well. Now, a lot of our understanding of land and land use comes out a number of writings, especially like we go back in time into the 60s and 70s, and there were some very interesting writers and authors back then. One of those was Garrett Hardin, 1968, wrote Tragedy of the Commons. And it basically says, it doesn't matter what you think of. In this scenario, we're talking about grazing sheep on a common area of land that's owned by, say, the community. And the use of the commons, historically was at or below the carrying capacity for the land. And therefore, anybody who owns sheep or whatever could use that piece of property to their benefit. And the whole community as a community would benefit from that. But as capitalism and other concepts start to take hold, you see that one or more users increases the commons, their number of sheep that they're using on there to gain more benefit, right? And you push it beyond that sort of carrying capacity. And unless, really the environmental costs are accounted for and addressed in land use practices, eventually the land will be unable to support this activity entirely, and you degrade it to a point of collapse. And so the use of common land has to be regulated in some kind of way by the users themselves, whether they self-regulate, by a government agency. Remember that conversation we had regarding government interference in what is a normal or natural system. We need some sort of control put in place so that degradation doesn't occur. So legal rights to land use and features are protected under the Constitution. That's where we started with this semester, right? But let's think about things like petroleum and groundwater. It sits under your ground. Both are underground. Both can be extracted underneath your land. And they can be extracted from adjacent lands, right? These things are all connected underground. So if you start pulling out water or petroleum products from underneath your property, it's going to change the dynamics of the surrounding area. And again, if not checked, users are going to maximize their extraction to their benefit. So again, the government has to sort of interfere in some way. Now you take the tragedy of the commons concept a step further and you talk about development into the wildland urban interface. And unfortunately, this is one of those areas where historically we've made a lot of choices and maybe made some mistakes. California today has 5.1 million homes that are located in what are considered high risk areas. And so we've allowed a lot of development into this area to occur in the past. So the question is, do we allow that to continue? Because somebody could always point and say, well, you used to let this happen. Why wouldn't you let it still continue, right? Why are you impacting my ability to use my property now just because I'm a little late to the game? What about things like timber harvest, right? Timber harvest is, one of those issues that we know, if done properly can be, more or less sustainable, but if improper, can, cause degradation to the ecosystem, significant and in some cases irreversible. So on any piece of property, there are compatible and incompatible uses to be certain. But the question then becomes, who regulates all of this, right? How do we put a framework in place to make sure all of this stuff is taken care of? And that's kind of what we've been talking about this semester, right? It mostly started in the 1970s or 60s and into the 70s. We had things like the Wilderness Act, and we talked last week about NEPA. We've talked about Clean Air and CEQA. We'll talk about the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act next time. But all of this stuff, air, land, water, biodiversity, all of this stuff is now addressed by some type of law and regulation. Now, the original court's view on all of this, though, is before all these laws and things were put into place, the idea was that if you own a piece of property, that resource is owned by the landowner, right? But that becomes a little bit difficult to move or to address when the resource moves, right? Hunting and fishing, for example. If you have a stream on your property, are the fish that are in that stream on your property at that time yours? Are the deer or the ducks or anything else, right? It becomes a little complicated. So states very early on decided that all fish and wildlife within their states are under the jurisdiction of the state. They are owned by that state, more or less. But other things like water resources, petroleum resources, right? All of those things had to get hashed out in the courts, and we had a lot of interesting cases that help define how we allocate our land and our resources today. It's tough if you're extracting water from underground to know exactly how much water is yours versus your neighbors, how much you should be allocated, how much needs to remain in the ecosystem. Clean Water Act does a good job of trying to help define all of that, but it's definitely not an easy thing to deal with. Quantities are difficult to determine. Recovery, if somebody is taking your allocation of a resource from underneath you, also difficult to define. And your losses are difficult to prove because you don't have a slip of paper that says you're supposed to have this much water or something, right? It doesn't really work that way. Then the courts kind of revised their view, and they and this was especially true in the eastern United States. It was what we call the capture rule. You own the resource that you can extract, right? And so, not surprisingly, people began extracting as fast as possible before their neighbors could. And this led to rapid losses of those resources. Then there was this sort of correlative rights doctrine, and it became more dominant in the legal system, where property owners overlying a resource hold rights and can produce their fair share of it. And it doesn't mean that your neighbor can't extract your water or your oil from underneath them if that state allows that to occur, but they don't have to compensate you for it, right? And there's this whole strategy to figuring out what your correlative right is, what you should be paid for that resource. And if you want to exercise that extraction yourself, what right do you have to that if somebody has already started that process, albeit on their land, right? It gets very complicated. So what are the solutions to all of this, right? The first is just eliminate the commons altogether, right? Make sure that there's only one firm that represents all landowners, monopolizing more or less, right? Very unpopular sort of solution, but having that much governmental control is one solution. There can be disagreements among owners over how to allocate revenue. How you can regulate this all by the state is fairly complex, and each state tends to take a little bit of different viewpoint because each state has a slightly different perspective on these resources. Regional planning is another solution, though, right? Creating sustainable forests. If you have a patchwork of ownership across a piece of property, getting everybody to come to the table and say, hey, look, when I cut down my forest, it's going to impact my neighbors, their air quality, water quality, biodiversity, invasive species, fire risk, all of those sort of things. So let's come up with a regional plan to deal with these things. And so you get sustainable forest plans, you get planning for endangered species, conservation planning, watershed management planning, right? But it involves a lot of different stakeholders, and it really requires their participation. And it means that you're trying to bring together a lot of diverse needs and perspectives under one program and try and meet all of that. Now, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management did this very early on, right? So they operate and still today operate under that multiple use philosophy. And so it's trying to balance these massive acreages that they're responsible for and say, well, what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to have recreation, we want to have forestry, we want to have mining, we want to have grazing, we want to have protected areas, camping and passive, uses, and protecting biodiversity and watersheds. It's a very difficult puzzle to try and put together to make sure everybody is satisfied at some level. And honestly, in a lot of these regional planning efforts, you cannot satisfy everybody at every level. And so what that ends up doing is creating this decision-making where somebody takes the hit more or less, right? Other solutions, conserving the resources, don't use them, set them aside, keep them protected. The other is to regulate those uses, create development plans, create limits on extraction, create limits on pollution, right? Or the other one is monetizing externalities and ecological services. Put a dollar amount to it. If you're going to do this to the environment, if you're going to build here or extract these trees or do whatever it is, it's more than just the cost of that extraction. There's a cost to the environment, to public health, to all the things we've been talking about. So you put a dollar amount to that and say, you're in addition to what you're paying for, say, a permit fee or an extraction or whatever, you're going to have to pay these additional fees on top of it. Not very popular way of doing things. And then, of course, there's just that idea of conservation, right? In general, like limit the amount of energy and water and things that you use. Make sure you're making wise decisions. It falls under, again, that umbrella of sustainability. Now, economists prefer to encourage change by economic means, right? And that's one of the things that we struggle with, especially in things like land and timber harvest, energy or water, is trying to figure out what does that forest mean in terms of dollar amounts to the public, right? If you are the U.S. Forest Service, you are holding property for the benefit of the people of the United States. And everybody's got a slightly different perspective of what that means and what they want as an American citizen, what they want that to represent for them. And so now all of a sudden you're responsible for managing all of those expectations and really trying to create, direct and indirect costs and externalities. But the economists say, well, this is really the best solution. But it's very difficult to do that. And then you have to remember that a lot of activities that we do want to promote in the United States are subsidized fairly heavily, right? The oil and natural gas industry has been for years heavily subsidized. Grazing and cattle and other extractive uses, timber and all that, they've been subsidized by the government, because if you were to pay those true costs, for what the public would have to, pay for those products or services or whatever, just it's insurmountable. So that brings us to the question of, well, what is sustainability, right? And there's a bunch of different definitions on this, but it covers everything under this sort of big umbrella of air, water, environment, ecosystems, products and materials, energy, minerals, waste, and trash and refuse, the economy generally, our population, education, transportation, timber, housing, species, habitats. It's everything. And so the broadest of definitions says sustainability is the ability to achieve continuing economic prosperity while protecting natural systems and providing high quality of life, economy, environment, society. Graphically, it's probably easiest to see it this way, right? People, planet, profit. That's the three things that we're going to try and figure out how to balance. And if you can find that balance in the middle, then you've achieved some level of sustainability. Now, sustainability is difficult because, again, not all properties, not all decisions, not all management plans are able to achieve that nice balance that you see there in the middle. Sometimes something's going to take a hit. Wilderness areas are a good example, right? We've identified places in the country that are so unique that, and this goes even beyond national parks, where we said these areas are going to remain roadless. They're not going to have a lot of public involvement. We're not going to allow any extraction or hiking or recreational use. We're going to limit a lot of stuff on this property, and we're going to protect it because of its ecological or environmental value, right? That's one extreme. And in that case, the planet benefits, right? The stool is sort of leaning, that three-legged stool is leaning toward the planet. You're not getting a lot of profit off of it. And people, depending on your perspective, maybe you like that concept, maybe you don't, but it's hard to find that balance. In other cases, when you choose to do timber extraction or heavy mining or other activities, well, oftentimes profit takes center stage there, and that extraction of those resources is being done at a cost to the environment. So overall, what your goal is to make decisions that overall are in that sort of center and kind of average themselves out, right? But this has emerged as a theme of the 21st century. It's a concept that balances the interconnectedness of the environment, the economy, and our quality of life, and recognizes that we have stewardship over all of these things. But the one thing that I haven't seen much of is the idea that wildfires become an important part of this dialogue. Starting to see that more now, especially in the context of climate change. But for many, many years, wildfires were not a big part of the discussion. And I guess, you can kind of understand why, right? Wildfires weren't as common and weren't as devastating as they were, especially over the last 10 years, but really since 2003, when we started to see that big shift. The other thing, too, you got to recognize is that in 2008, we hit a very interesting milestone in the world's population. More than half of the people living in the world were now living in urban areas rather than rural areas, right? And we've seen that in the United States, that sort of vacating of wild and rural populations into cities. It's where the jobs are, it's where education is, it's where the economies are. And so those more extractive uses that are often associated with rural populations, things like mining and agriculture, forestry and timber harvest, those are kept in rural areas, but you don't have as many people living there as you used to. And the result of that, though, is that we still want to have that rural type lifestyle. And so as we've made these transitions in our populations, you get what we have today, which is this weird intermix of, heavily industrialized and urbanized settings like, say, Los Angeles, that sort of leak into our rural communities, where we still want all the benefits of a more urban environment, but still want to have the benefits of a rural community as well. And that's where the wildland urban interface is today. So just to highlight this a little bit more, urbanization is the process where people are increasingly moving from rural areas to densely populated cities and city centers. Like I said earlier, jobs define urban versus rural, not the population itself, it's the types of jobs. Rural occupations involve harvesting natural resources in many respects. Urban areas involve jobs not always connected with natural resources. And so because of this shift in employment, that's where you're seeing people move. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. This sort of combining or, growth of urbanization into these core areas creates these, mega cities, right? Los Angeles Basin, is an example of one of these, right? But you can see on the map here, whether you're talking about Boston or Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth area, Los Angeles, Miami, doesn't matter. There's these pockets of, heavy population use. And then you'll see that there's areas that are fairly rural and then everything else in between, right? And that's what complicates our land use and the patterns of land use and decisions that we make. With urbanization comes that urban interface, right? A demand for housing, the infrastructures, the water, sewer, gas, electricity, communications. That means you need to get people in and out of these areas. And so we've created an interesting transportation dilemma because most of the times these more suburban neighborhoods, while they're wonderful to live in, they don't have local jobs for folks. And so you end up commuting to work. So we've created these transportation nightmares for many communities. Commercial services and other things that communities typically have are often not very well designed or included in these more suburban areas. And so you'll see that push for local employment and the kinds of jobs that the folks living there want to have, but it's very hard to match those things up. And so what you end up creating are what we call these positive feedback loops, right? You build more housing, you need more roads, you need more infrastructure, you need more transportation, and it just kind of starts to feed back on itself. And it's been spiraling out of control, especially in places like California. Now, regional planning can really help. I'll talk a little bit about some of that a little bit later here. Regional planning can definitely help with this, but it's not the only solution, right? Now, there can be benefits from urbanization. Don't discount it entirely. A well-planned city can actually be a benefit to the environment, right? It can, if designed properly and managed appropriately, reduce pollution and preserve those rural or natural areas. Compact design and design of cities where residential buildings are close, shopping, jobs, public transportation, right? Those are all good things, but you have to remember you design it for risk too, right? It can't just be absent that type of planning. It's also a process of deciding the best use for undeveloped land or the future, what the future holds for that piece of property, and trying to look out prospectively and say 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, what do we want that piece of property to look like, right? There's a big, again, with regard to economics, there's a big economic aspect of this, right? And you saw that in some of the readings that you have in chapters, 4 and 5 this week. When they talk about economics, like a lot of the focus is on the economics of wildfires, right? That's what the book chapters are really about. But economic concerns, that include wildfires are pretty diverse, right? And so when we start to think about the way we build out the remaining land that we have and the choices that we make in land use, we have to balance that concept, again, that sustainability concept of what do we protect and why, what do we allow to be built and why, and then how do you integrate, economic prosperity with quality of life, and at the same time protect the community from major disasters that could occur. And so we talked last time a little bit about zoning and how that authority sort of emerged. But really what happened over the years is what we're all very familiar with today is that suburban sprawl, right? A patchwork of vacant and developed tracts that are on the edges or just outside our cities. And they contribute to air and water pollution and a loss of habitat and increase our risk of wildland-urban interface incidents. And that was very prevalent in places like California. So how do we create more sustainability, right? I mean, it starts with our cities. You need clear, cohesive urban growth policies and suburban and rural growth policies, efficient use of energy and other resources, reducing pollution and waste, and making sure that large urban areas aren't devoid of green space and healthy outdoors environments, parks and other open space, right? It also means being prospective and saying that some land is going to be created as a buffer, right, between high risk areas. If you're going to build golf courses or soccer fields or ball fields or something, maybe that's what you put at the edges of your communities to protect and provide that extra layer of buffer between the wildland areas, right? It also means we have to be more efficient with the way we do things. And there should be a goal embedded in all of this to minimize community risk. Education, I think, plays a real important part of that. That's why we talk about this. That's why we have, some of the other courses that you take talk a lot about land use and planning and those sort of concepts of reducing risk, because the more you understand this, as you become part of that decision-making body that's helping build our communities or maintaining them or change them over time, this is a big piece of that puzzle. And having curricula at all school levels, so people really start to understand these concepts. I think one thing we've probably seen over the last year is teaching science, to the general public is not easy. And you need good translators, you need good people who are able to really take complex information and allow decision makers and the public to understand it. Part of the puzzle also is creating the opportunity for conservation and institutions that promote sustainability, encouraging other groups to participate, right? Having that diverse and sort of equitable representation at the table when these decisions are being made. And like we've talked about earlier, information is critical to all of this, right? You have to have good information going into it. That's what CEQA and NEPA do, right? They try and give you that good information to make decisions. But if that information isn't good to start with, then your planning process is flawed from the very beginning. But everything starts at the local level, right? Everything starts at the local level. We have city councils or county boards of supervisors. These are elected officials in most cases, and they have basically three types of things that they can do, right? And so we've talked a lot about the federal government's role. We've talked a lot about state government, but local government is a very specific sort of responsibility. It has legislative actions, things like creating general policy decisions, the general plan, revisions, zoning ordinances. Quasi-judicial responsibilities, things like approving, individual projects, decisions that are made more on the ministerial side are acts where the council or the county has really no discretion, right? Mandatory issuance of permits once conditions are met. Typically, this is all done at the staff level. So again, how does this all feed back into what we've learned about already? Well, under CEQA, don't forget, one of the things we talked about was that the legislator finds and declares it's the policy of the state of California that public agencies should not approve a project as proposed if there are feasible alternatives or feasible mitigation measures which would substantially lessen environmental impacts. Right. So now, keeping that in mind, this is where CEQA becomes a really important tool in the state of California. And it doesn't matter what project we're talking about, housing development, commercial or industrial, transportation, timber harvesting plans. If there's a CEQA nexus that requires the state to be involved at some level, which most projects do, then you have to try and figure out how to reduce those environmental impacts to the maximum extent that you can, that's practical. Right. And so what we do at both the city and county level is we provide plans, right? And we plan the communities out and in our jurisdictions, and we start with all these different levels from general, specific to zoning to subdivision, right? And the general plan is really the city's most basic planning document. It's a blueprint for development. This is what started with the World's Fair when they were talking about creating utopian cities, right? It's creating a map of what you want that city to look like and where you want stuff to occur. It's comprehensive, it's long-term, and both the city and its neighbors are all looking at this, trying to figure out how do all these pieces of the puzzle come together. It has to be internally consistent and contain policies that are compatible with one another. So there are 7 mandatory elements in any general plan. There's land use, the circulation or transportation sort of aspect, housing, conservation and open space, noise, and safety. These are all aspects that must be considered by general plans now in the state of California. They can include other options like recreation or healthy communities or economic development. Any subject is appropriate, right? Planning in the city of Temecula that I'll talk about, we have a senior master plan, right? We have a parks and recreation master plan. We have a trails plan, right? This is all part of that sort of general planning that a city does. It's any decision that we make has to be consistent with that basic document. That is our blueprint for what a city looks like. And if somebody comes to us and says, hey, you've got my property zoned as such, and then, under the general plan, it says this about what I can do with it. And if they come to us and say, well, I want to follow the plan, I want to build this on my property, or I want to do this with the land, it's allowed, basically. We've given them a roadmap to how to use their property. Approval is a legislative act, right? This is a quasi-legislative act that the cities or counties will do, and it is subject to judicial review. You can litigate over this and question whether or not folks are following this plan. Now, if you take a look for a moment at the plan for the city of Temecula, for instance, right, just to orient, this is Highway 15 running through here. Down here is the border with San Diego and Riverside County. For those of you who know, this is the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve that's managed, owned by SDSU for the most part. If you go down here, this is all, for the most part, Pechanga Tribal Trust land. But you can see sort of how a city is zoned, right? The areas in this color are medium density residential. This color represents lower density residential. So you have, larger lot sizes here and here in the city. Blue represents industrial commercial activity. Red represents high level sort of commercial activity, auto mall, the regular mall, that sort of thing. Different types of industrial services as well in the purple areas. And so what you do is you kind of break up your community into these little areas where we expect to have certain services and things provided. And it gives everybody who owns property or is working with the city, again, that sort of framework of how stuff is going to be managed, right? And so you'll see very commonly in plans like this, discrete sections of cities where planning has occurred and designated those uses. So in the middle of this area here, for instance, you're not going to see somebody come forward with a proposal to, open up, a warehouse, right? Or a manufacturing facility or an industrial complex, because it's just simply incompatible with everything that's inside of that property. No more than you would want to see somebody come in here in the heavy industrial area and propose housing, right? Because your increase in air pollution and traffic and noise and all the other factors that are important to quality of life are going to be intruded on, and you don't want to create those types of conflicts. Now, if you go from that general plan, one below down is what we call a specific plan. And this is kind of a more zoomed in view of your community. And it allows you to do more what we call specific planning. And so it has to be consistent with that general plan, up on the top level. But it zooms in a bit. And so you can pick these kind of little neighborhood areas and decide what you want them to look like. And so we've done one of those along the I-15 corridor, along Jefferson Avenue. It needs a lot of upgrades along that area. A lot of that, the city of Temecula, as an example, we've only been incorporated since 1989. So it's really only been a city since 1989. And prior to that, it was unincorporated Riverside County. And so not all the decisions that the county made were consistent with what we see as a vision with the city today. And so you do things like specific planning to be a little bit more narrow and encourage different types of development. And so we've done that here, right? And you design a plan that says, this is what we would like to see in these areas. Now, it's not what's currently there necessarily. Yeah, some of the existing uses are consistent and all that, but it's a plan for the future. And you provide this sort of concept that says, we'd like to see more mixed use. We'd like to see more green space. We'd like to see, more be able to live and work within that community, and see things evolve slightly differently. And we can provide incentives to developers and landowners to basically do just that, right? Our incentives can come in the form of easy permitting process. So we created what we call a form-based code, where if a developer comes in and they put plans on the table and they say, hey, we are going to follow exactly what you laid out in your specific plan, and we want to build a mixed-use facility that includes, housing on the second and third floor, and on the first floor is where we want some commercial space and coffee shops and restaurants and other things, blah, blah, blah. They don't have to go through CEQA. We've done it for them already. And that is a huge incentive because it saves a ton of money, right? And it streamlines the whole process. There's a number of other incentives that we built in as well. But this is how cities get landowners to think differently about their property or move in a direction that's different. Now, this wasn't done in isolation, right? This was all done under a CEQA approval for this specific plan that was passed. And there was a lot of community dialogue and discussion, tons of workshops, and hundreds, if not thousands of people got involved in the conversation to come up with a plan that we thought everybody could more or less live with. So how we design our communities, though, again, because this is all about fire here, has implications for wildfires and community risk. Now, let me go back to our specific plan here. One of the things you should know is that this area down here is all considered, to be open space, and it is Murrieta Creek. Now, Murrieta Creek doesn't pose a severe high fire risk for the community, but it's a fire risk nonetheless. And so we want to be able to, again, create those buffers between these areas. This area we want to see stay as open space. Why? Because it's a flood protection area for the rest of the city. So we want to make sure nobody builds in this area and that it remains open space, and that when we have major flooding events, this can fill up with water and not impact the rest of the community or further south into Old Town, where they've had devastating floods as early back as the 90s. So that's the whole process. So, you create, again, these buffers and things, and a lot of this, we build into our codes, right? So when you start to design communities and all that, you give guidelines and you say, okay, if you're going to build here and you've got upslopes or downslopes, here's the expectations of what you would need to do to protect your property, right? And here's the standard that we want to set. And all of this should be familiar to you at this point, right? Defensible space and all of that. And this is what communities will do to design and foster good planning and land use. But it's not to say it's perfect. There's plenty of planning failures. This is a great example of one of those that I reviewed a few years ago, where they decided to put, I think it was 427 units into an area that had one road in and out. And they were doing nothing really to mitigate that. And the bottom line was, what we found out is the reason they don't have access to a second road wasn't because there couldn't be, there wasn't, an opportunity for one to be built. It's that the person who owned that property was asking too much, or so they thought, too much for the cost of putting that easement and the road in. And so really the county had two options at that point. The county could have just said, you have to obtain that easement and that right to that extra road, or you will not build your property, right? Your project will not move forward. Or in some cases, you could take it through eminent domain. Now, most times that's the least preferred option, and cities and counties hate doing that. So that's not going to occur. So what they said was, well, we're just going to make sure that you mitigate to the maximum extent practicable within this property. And, we're going to take a 2-lane road and make it into a 3-lane road. And that's going to be part of the mitigation. And, part of the comments from a lot of organizations and folks looking at this project said, that's definitely not sufficient. The modeling that was done suggested that the community was not at risk for major wildfire although that community had, and that area had burnt down several times in the last 20 years. And what they did is they modeled the fires based on what had occurred in the past. But the ignitions for those fires were farther away from the community. And so they said if a fire starts, the community has, 45 minutes to an hour to evacuate effectively. And we said, no, that is absolutely untrue. If the fire started on a Santa Ana wind day, right next to that community, because somebody was careless with their barbecue grill or their embers or whatever, that community under that, high wind condition would be surrounded by fire within 7 minutes, right? That's the reality of what we need to deal with. And that's the level that we need to plan for. And so, we've talked about this in some of the other classes before, where I've used these examples of projects or properties where they've tried to do the right thing. We're going to provide secondary access roads like over here, right? We're going to provide that secondary access road, and we're going to create 2 levels of buffer around the community that will help protect that community in the event of a fire. And then we're going to have a fire station, although the fire station isn't near here, but we're going to build the new one, and hopefully their response times are good enough. But then it came down to, the modeling and the questions, and asking the toughest of the questions, which was, our fires aren't causing our communities to burn down because direct flame impingement is the issue. The issue is the embers and firebrands, and we now recognize that as the more acute threat to our communities when there's a major fire going on. So if you leave all of this open space and don't manage this vegetation here, and don't manage it in between the community, and put homes close together, you get these conflagrations that can be absolutely devastating. So while 20 years ago we may have thought, well, this is an acceptable standard, we know today that it isn't. And so then the question is, well, how do you enforce this? How do you make decisions? And we've talked about this in the past too, like, fire protection planning, right? That's one of the other things that we can do, protecting our communities. Deer Springs Fire Protection District, we helped rewrite their plan several years ago. This was the original understanding of what their fire risk is in the community. This is an absolutely useless map. Everything is just listed as high risk, extreme severity fire zone. And it's like, no, that's really not it. It's, there are temperatures of risk, right? From high to medium to low. And you need to be aware of that. And you need to be able to get a lot better resolution, understand where your assets are, understand where fire stations are, and what, that short response times might look like. Understand where the highest risk vegetative areas are, and then understand where things like nursing homes and childcare centers and other sensitive resources and things that are difficult to evacuate, where those occur within the community. Then you can actually start doing some real planning, right? So let's talk a little bit about the chapters I wanted you to read. It was, I apologize, chapters 3 and 4. They talk a lot about the cost of wildfires in chapter 3, right? And they talk about this sort of combination of laws from liability to tort to property. And we talked about that already, but I wanted to re-emphasize that and get you a little bit more information on it, because that is really the core of what we have available to us, absent strict fire laws themselves. We know that there's a lot of different types of risks, right? The spread of accidental ignitions. Negligence can lead to liability. It may be an accident and you may be sorry about it, but that doesn't absolve you of that responsibility. The operations and maintenance and operating procedures are important. From railroads to sawmills to HOAs, everybody needs to be aware and follow, those guidelines, and create plans that are meaningful so that the communities are protected. But you have to make sure you follow those plans. You have to have prompt and reasonable measures. You have to have firefighters, equipment, and apparatus, and you have to have it funded properly. That's one of the big downfalls in a lot of our communities, is we don't provide adequate funding for it. And then you have to, think about that again. It's that resilience, that sustainability piece. How do you recover from this? If we know that a natural disaster like a fire or an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever it is, if we know these things have a high probability of occurring, we need to have a plan in place that shows how we're going to recover from it, right? That's important. And that often is they don't spend nearly enough time on that, in my opinion. And then there's, of the other types of risk, there's accidental, but then there's intentional, right? There's intentional fires, and then there's, the more common issue that we're worried about today is the actual fuels management, whether it's a controlled burn or just the use of mechanical tools. You can spread fire simply through, that, accidental escape. Whether it's intentional or not, it's still a fire, right? So the book talks a little bit about tort liability and negligence and trespass. Time and place matters. Putting things in place to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the risks, extremely important. It shows your due diligence in making sure that you're doing things as carefully as possible. And then we talked about strict liability and gross negligence that occurs in some states. And I want to reemphasize this because, again, these are the tools we have available to us. And the question keeps coming up of, well, how do you take these tools and get them into some sort of specific fire law? And it's very difficult to craft something that really can help meet that need, right? So we're kind of left to this hodgepodge of different issues. The other thing is each fire itself seems to be its own unique case study in a lot of respects. What's the prior condition of the land itself? When an owner realizes or should realize that their land possesses an unreasonable risk with regard to, say, fire, what is their responsibility? And when should they have known about that responsibility? Did they create that condition themselves? Did a third-party user, let's say they lease their land out for timber harvest or grazing, was it created by a third party? Or was it created with a third party without consent, some sort of trespass issue that you weren't aware of on, vast acreage that you own? You have to take reasonable care of the property. You're responsible for all those scenarios, believe it or not. And then there's constructive knowledge, you actually know these things are going on, versus should have known, right? If you visited your property more than once every 10 years, you should have known what this condition of that property was, right? Don't be that absentee landowner, because your absenteeism is increasing risk in the community, and you are responsible for that. Unfortunately, in a lot of our laws and a lot of the court cases, things like natural fuels are vaguely defined. They don't like touching that kind of stuff because it's real fuzzy language, right? I like to talk about benign neglect, right? You own a piece of property and you just let it sit there and you don't do a lot to manage that property. Benign neglect, from an ecological perspective, sometimes not a bad thing, right? You just let nature do what nature does. But that doesn't work in all cases. When you have property adjacent to, the human population, or it has the risk of, causing a fire here and making its way into that, urban or suburban environment, it's a big deal. That's a big responsibility that you have that not everybody is aware of or takes seriously. And of course, you layer on top of that all the local, the state, the federal laws, regulations, ordinances, all of that matters. So that's why I say, it's this patchwork of stuff that gets layered on top of each other, from federal law down to state law, down to general plans and specific plans and local ordinances and code and everything else. That's how you define, how property is supposed to be managed and how you manage risk. Now, there's a lot of trade-offs in all of this, right? Wildfire management, some of the things they talk about is, cost benefit analysis, economics. If we want economics to help drive this conversation, cost benefit analysis can certainly be a useful tool, but it's not legally binding, right? Most of our laws don't, they may request, some cost benefit analysis and all that, but it's not a legally binding document. And there's nothing in these laws that say you have to follow the recommendations or conclusions. Oftentimes, too, cost benefit analysis is based on a subjective comment of risk and fuzzy math and algorithms. Now, the economic studies I'm asking you to read this week, they were put together with the best information that we had at the time. And we gleaned, tons of documentation and information and ledgers of what was spent on the Cedar Fire and the complex of fires in San Diego, Paradise, and Otay in 2003. But when it comes down to it, there are some areas that are still pretty fuzzy when it comes to the math. And so cost benefit analysis is a useful tool, but it's not a perfect tool. You can create incentives to manage the land, right? Insurance breaks, tax credits, right? That's a carrot, right? The economic incentive. An incentive not to impact your neighbors, not always the most compelling. Incentives to get neighbors to manage their properties together as partners. That's what HOAs and other organized, entities are there for. Creating clear standards and definitions of negligence is always difficult to do because, again, each fire is almost its own unique case study. The last sort of piece that the chapter talks about is contingent insurance, right? Linking compliance and mitigation with insurance coverage, insurance rates, continued coverage, discounted rates, right? Because you got to think from the insurer's perspective, they don't have to cover you. There's no obligation for them to cover you at all. They can look at your property and say, no, the risk's too high. And in fact, after the 2003 fires and subsequent to that, a lot of insurance carriers just said, yeah, we're not going to get in that business anymore. It's just too high risk for us. What a lot of people don't know is that insurance companies carry insurance. State Farm is reinsured by a much larger insurance company that nobody ever talks about, right? They carry their own insurance. They pay out what they can, but they have their own policy that they write off as well. And so that's the difficulty in that is if the reinsurer, that top level insurance company doesn't want to insure State Farm for covering houses in San Diego County, for instance, State Farm just says, it's just not worth it. We're not going to take the risk ourselves. Our policy on carrying our insurance is too high, so we're done. We don't need to cover houses built in, areas of San Diego County. And that's exactly what happens. But creating contingent insurance policies could be an important tool that forces landowners to do, what's necessary to protect those properties. And so, but it's self-protection. And again, the other issue too, of course, is that maintenance piece, right? And the enforcement piece. The insurance carriers now have to make sure that you're doing what you need to do every year to protect that property. And so it gets difficult to create that level of enforcement and oversight. I wanted to provide some closing thoughts here on talking about all the liability over fire and what we've talked about so far this semester. Making modern law fit within modern times and risks is very difficult because a lot of what we base our law off of today are on old laws, old cases, old court decisions, and old ordinances. And unfortunately, oftentimes our legislatures, our code, our local ordinances, they simply don't follow as quickly as they should with changing times. We need to redefine risk, liability, and incentives and come up with better ways. Clearly, what we're doing doesn't work. So we need to be a little bit more nimble. Negligence, in fact, needs to be clearly defined, right? But for most, tort law cases, negligence is poorly defined. Common law does not deal with negligence very well. It's, again, the uniqueness of the fires and these, sort of one-off case studies makes this very difficult. Creating actionable standards for landowners to comply with. When do you say somebody is out of compliance with brush clearing? Right? You have to have clear definitions of what that actually means. And don't forget that if you want to clear brush and you want to do these things to protect your property, well, you're going to bump up against the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, CEQA, all sorts of other things that tell you can't have an impact on the environment, right? So how do we get past all of that? How do we make sure that the regulation and legal environment doesn't create a barrier to protecting our communities from wildfire risk? So we'll throw out a few solutions here and there, take them or leave them. Regulation and incentives for landowners and developers, it can be a pretty big thing, right? Especially the incentive piece. Paying people to do the right thing always seems to be a good and active solution. Developing vegetation management plans. Obviously an important part of any community. California has standards for mitigating wildfire risk, fire and building code. So make sure you have those, but make sure they're consistent and make sure they're current. And that's where we struggle a little bit. Fuel management has to be consistent across public, private, and private public properties, right? That intermix of all the different ownerships. If you've got one link in the chain that is weak, that weakness will be exploited during a fire incident. And then who pays for all of this, right? Landowners, if you bought your property 20, 30, 40 years ago, or it's been in your family for generations, and you've never had to manage it a certain way, and now you're being told you have to, where do you get the money to do that? It's not an easy thing to try and figure out. Who pays for what? What happens when one property owner isn't compliant? In some cases, the municipality will do the work, send you a bill or place a lien on the property and say, that's it. We took care of it for you, but you still have a financial obligation. And if you don't pay, then we'll have a lien on the property. And if that property ever sells, we get paid out first. Not a popular solution. All right. The next chapter deals with economics and suppression of fires, right? Chapter 4. The economics of wildfires. Who owns the fire? Who bears the cost of the fire? Who benefits from the fire? These are all core questions in this chapter. And I think they've done a really good job of kind of laying that out. Most economic studies focus on suppression costs. That's why I'm asking you all to dig into some economic study on a fire and kind of go through and answer some of those questions this week. Because the way things get reported, it tends to focus on suppression costs or the physical costs of loss of property, which are usually pretty easy numbers to get from insurance companies or FEMA or others. But like the study that we produced and others have since show, is the costs are a lot more diverse than that. And when you really start to think about, the trickle down effect that occurs after a major incident, these costs are substantial and they're long lasting in some cases. So, and again, when you're talking about fires, there are some benefits from fires. We can't ignore that there are benefits, right? It's a reset of that ecosystem, and some ecosystems are fire dependent to some degree. So the bottom line really is land ownership and management drive our current systems of organization for wildfire suppression and response. But the type of ownership of the fire, that's become sort of a challenge here, right? The sole ownership, your single landowner versus several owners of a property versus diverse multi-level public-private ownership. Who owns the responsibility of that risk? Well, it's hard to define. Remember, I started talking earlier about, who owns the water under your land or the oil under your land. That's hard to define. This is just crazy complicated, right? Government suppression is the best model for most situations. We know the government in its many forms, from local, state to federal, provides the best, model for fire protection. There are private firefighting agencies. There are volunteer fire departments as well. Some sort of organized, fire suppression is necessary. It's based on complexity, uncertainty, and diversity of parties, right? So you can manage to have one sort of major response entity like CAL FIRE, for instance, LA County Fire, all these departments that have umbrella oversight, but models need to be able to figure out how to mitigate costs and burdens and balance the need for suppression versus the need for natural fire. Is there an obligation to justify the use of resources, right? Is more always better, right? I mean, that's a core question that this chapter really starts to dig into. And I think it's an important one too, right? When you're talking about the costs and burdens and maximizing benefits of land, sustainability, all of those issues, how do you justify the use of all of those resources? And how do you justify, the risks inherent in all of this? Now, let's talk a little bit about, the publication I asked you to read on the 2003 San Diego wildfires. We talk about this in terms of, one of the largest fires in California. It was the largest fire in California's history at that time. It's been surpassed quite a bit. The basics on this are, close to 400,000 acres burned total between Paradise Cedar and Otay fires. Over 3,000 homes lost, 16 lives lost. And at peak, they had over 6,600 crew working in San Diego County. The economic impacts that we were able to identify suggested that the fires cost close to $2.5 billion in all, or over $6,500 per acre. State of California, between its insurance requirements, short-term budget impacts, long-term budget impacts, future resource impacts, we calculated all that out to be roughly $100 million. The loss of infrastructure, transportation, water quality, utilities replacement, communication repairs came out to about $147 million. Natural areas and the impacts from natural areas, from species and habitat loss, erosion control, flood control, water quality impacts, cultural and historic resources, these were pretty substantial, right? In the tens of millions of dollars when we talked about impacts to natural areas. For our businesses, when you have such major impacts in a region, you're going to impact goods and services. You're going to have unemployment that occurs for some of the businesses, and long-term losses for those businesses that are lost entirely. Shipping delays. When you shut down the airport and you shut down the port for a number of days, you shut down the freeway system, that's going to have a huge impact on your economy. And then, of course, tourism. Tourism brings in a lot of money in certain communities, so there's going to be a huge impact there. When you think about the impact to businesses, the estimate of work and business losses was $365 million, or 15% of the total economic burden of those fires. Unemployment insurance topped out around $400 million. And if you want to go back to per acre costs, most of these things cost roughly $1,000 an acre, right? Your community, your employment, your health and human services, your tax implications. When you wipe out 3,000 plus homes, they're not paying property taxes the same way they would. And so there's a loss there, right? When businesses aren't operating, there's a loss of tax revenue there. So your community takes a pretty big hit overall as well. And that community impact comes in a lot of different forms. FEMA kicks in about $300 million on that incident. Grants and donations topped out ultimately, I think, close to 15 million. And then the property losses themselves, the actual loss of calculated property that was paid for to be replaced or repaired or compensated in some respect, came out to about 1.2 billion dollars, right? Or about half of really the total economic loss. And so when you break it out, you realize that, yeah, the community takes a pretty heavy burden, the community and the businesses, right? There are losses to infrastructure, there's losses to the state, losses to natural areas, those can't be forgotten. But one of the things we wanted to emphasize in this original study was the idea that if you were able to, I apologize, this is fuzzy, if you were able to reduce the economic burden of these fires by, let's just say 10%, right? 10% cut across the board, and you were able to fight that fire more effectively in some respects to reduce that total economic loss. That's $250 million in economic savings, right? Now you have to remember that the total, if you read the report, the total cost of suppression was roughly 2% of the total economic loss. And so 2% savings would pay for the fire suppression, basically. I mean, when you start to think of it in terms of that, it's a pretty substantial thing to think, well, how do you achieve that? And this is really what we landed on toward the end. So this is one of the first studies we really got heavily engaged in. And we came up with this and sort of coincidentally looks not dissimilar from a lot of the logos in the Maltese cross. Emergency response effectiveness is based on what we consider 4 major factors, right? Number 1 is environmental conditions. What's happening? The wind speed, the air temperature, the relative humidity, all of those things, right? Then there's the land management. You have all of this acreage. What is the condition of that property up to that point when the ignition occurs? And then once that ignition occurs and that fire starts, you only have two things available to you: staff, the number of people you can put on the incident, and resources, the number of engines and air attack and everything else that you have available to you. And that combination of those four factors results in your emergency effectiveness, right? Or your attack effectiveness. Now, environmental conditions we can't control. I mean, we can and we can't, right? I mean, we talk about climate change and we talk about these other factors and issues that impact the landscape, the degradation, the invasive species, and all of that. But what's happening at that moment in time with regard to temperature and wind speed and all that, we don't have any control over those kinds of things, right? So let's discount that one for a moment. Land management. That's where a lot of focus is these days. We're focused a significant amount of our effort on trying to figure out how to manage the millions of acres that are in the state of California alone for fuel reduction. Well, that's a lot. I mean, if you look at the numbers, the millions of dollars that have been spent over the last several years in fuel reduction, and then you equate that to the number of acres that have actually been treated, effectively, and then recognize that, hey, you got to keep going back and doing the same thing. It's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. By the time you're done, you got to start all over again. And if you think that the state responsibility area alone is 31 million acres, that is a massive responsibility that discounts the state or the federal responsibility areas, tribal responsibility areas, and local government responsibility areas and private. The millions and millions of acres that we have to treat. So really the two things that you have the most direct control over are resources and staffing. And yet this is kind of the biggest debate. And there was a point in time where we had done some of the original staffing studies related to wildland fires and attack effectiveness. And we used this as sort of the example. And we said, look, when you're dealing with a major incident, how many firefighters you put on that fire and how many resources you have available to you, this is the result, right? This is how you reduce those economic impacts. And so what we've been saying and have for many years is simply the idea of us needing to invest more in resources and staffing to help shave off those costs and try and provide more attack effectiveness and protection of our communities. Natural areas will burn. But when that creeps into our urban, and suburban footprint, that's where these economic costs start to skyrocket. So the more you can do to, reduce those impacts and the economic burden, the better. But it's that sort of cost benefit analysis. At what point do we have enough staff? And how do you justify an investment in 1,000 more firefighters for the state of California versus, what does that mean as far as attack effectiveness? That's a very difficult conversation to have. And one of the more important ones that we need to be having right now, really truly is the crux of a lot of what this program and wildland and urban interface firefighting is all about, is trying to figure out how to solve this fairly, uncomplicated puzzle and make sure that we're putting the resources and the staffing and the funding and the management where it needs to go. Okay, so I'm going to end there and hope that you all have a wonderful week ahead. And I will be posting information later this week related to the final exam, giving a little bit more information about that. And I look forward to completing this semester with you all. Thank you so much.